In this lecture, we'll look at the elements of a policy. So you need to distinguish between a policy, a standard, a guideline, a procedure, a plan. We need to be able to identify different policy elements and then include the proper information in each element of a policy. We'll also need to know how to use plain language. It's really important that you're aware that policy writing is very different to, let's say, writing fiction. There's no prizes for flowery language in policy. It has to be clear, very predictable, very plain, and easily understood. So the structure of your communication is particularly important in policy. So there are important policy elements that we have to address, and these can be thought of as pieces of a puzzle. You're putting it together, and this will start with the objective of the policy, as well as the statement of purpose. Any statement of exceptions to the particular policy, and then the policy statements themselves, the substantive component. And so you have to make sure that these elements are going to be present in all policies at some level. So when we are reading the policy, we know exactly what to expect. So in our second lecture, we'll be discussing the main policy elements and the information security framework. This is perhaps the most important lecture in this course in many respects because it sets the framework for the other lectures. What we've got to know, firstly, are what the elements are of a policy. So we need to understand, to be able to distinguish between a policy, a standard, guideline, a procedure, and a plan. These are very, very important terms to be kept distinct in your mind. Oftentimes, people speak in very vague terms, in a vague way about some of these terms. It leads to a tremendous amount of confusion. So you need to be very, very clear about what these terms mean. So commit these definitions to memory. Then we're going to identify certain policy elements and include the proper information for each element of a policy. You have to be able to write in plain language terms for policy. It has to be simple, it has to be concise, it has to be accurate and logical. And these are all part of writing good policy. There's a certain style of writing that you'll have to develop if you want to write policy for organizations. Because remember, you may be writing the policy and know about the material, but you're writing for somebody who doesn't know the material or have any technical expertise. And that can be very challenging, as you'll see. So there are certain important policy elements that you will see in most policies. Firstly, you need to define the objective of the policy. You will have to write the statement of purpose, any exceptions, and of course the substantive policy statements themselves. Now ask yourself, are these policy elements particular to security policies? Probably not. I mean, there's a logical arrangement that has to be put in place, and these can apply to privacy policies equally as well. But we use them here primarily for the information security environment. So when you're writing a policy, you need to have supporting documentation. This makes it meaningful and helps the person who wants to know more find out where you got the information from. So supporting documents are usually incorporated by reference into the main policy document, and they fall outside of the policy themselves. They may be a reference to a standard or a guideline or set of procedures, and you're going to incorporate those by reference into your policy. That way, if the person needs a deep dive into some specifics, they can look at that additional material. Now, oftentimes, those standards may change more often than the policy itself. If you had to change your policy every time there was a new standard, a security standard out, then it would be very difficult. It would be very time consuming. So what we do is we reference the standard and incorporate that by reference into our policy document. So you need policy supporting documents in order to make the policy manageable. That way you can make the update, and that updates can be separate. And then you can review each policy document more easily so that you can get approval from the board of directors. You're going to get approval for the policy, but not the standard. The standard will be adopted and authorized by another group entirely in many cases. But the reference to the standard will be applied in the policy document, which will be ultimately approved or authorized by the board of directors in a company. When we talk about standards dictate the minimum requirements in our policy. They tend to change more frequently than the policy itself and are usually specific to a particular technology. You're going to reference a current industry best practice. And so your job is really to know what the best practices are, being able to figure out from your experience and from your research, what the standard that needs to be applied to the organization should be. Well, let's look at an example. What about password standards? So in access control, is the domain we'll look at later on, there will be a need to have a policy around passwords. But the policy will reference a particular standard. So the standard would be, let's say, a minimum 10 upper and lowercase characters, including one special character, and changed every 3 months. That's the standard. That can change. Right? But in the policy, you would have a policy statement such as all users must have a unique user ID and password that conforms to the company password standard. So the password standard is incorporated there by reference, and you can change that as you get new threats, for example. Another policy statement is that users must not share their password with anyone, and they cannot store their password in any readable form. Right? That's another password policy. You don't want people writing their passwords down, for example. Right? So you've got to think about when you're developing policy, what's likely to change more often, the policy or the standard? Right? Think about which is going to be more general. Policies are more general than standards. Standards are going to be typically very specific and likely to change with increased regularity. Baselines are the aggregate implementation standards and security controls for a grouping. So let's say, the operating system or the device or ownership or location. Right? For the password policy and standard example, which we've just discussed, a baseline could mandate that a specific Active Directory policy configuration be used on all Windows devices. So here it's broader, and when we look at integrating a system, the interoperability of a system, we need baselines to be in place. This should be distinguished from guidelines, which are suggestions in the policy world. Guidelines are thought of as teaching tools. They are suggestions on the best way to accomplish a certain task. Generally here we're using softer language. We're not using the imperative. We're not saying must or shall. They are likely to change more often than any other document, and it might help people comply with the standard. So a guideline would be, using a phrase or a band for your password with different characters. Let's say that's a guideline. You don't have to do it that way, but it's a suggestion. So here we have an example that a good way to create a strong password is to think of a phrase, song title, or group that's easy to remember and convert it this way. Right? So the phrase up and Adam at 7 could be converted to a password. And you can create many passwords this way by changing a punctuation mark. It's a good way of giving people a way of remembering their password. Procedures are provide instructions for how to accomplish a policy, standard, or guideline. The focus is on a set of actions or steps that, if followed, will result in success. So you need procedures. It's really the step-by-step instructions. There's a starting and ending point for an action. So you think about it as procedures like a recipe almost. You do this, and then you do that, and then you do the next thing. That's a procedure. So let's think of an IT example when we're going to get somebody to change their password. So for example, you might want to say, press Control-Alt-Delete, bring up the login dialog box, click the change password button, enter the current password, enter your new password, and then click OK. Can you think of more steps? Can you think of fewer steps? These are the challenges of policy writing. So you want to make sure that you have enough of the sequence to give the person the correct approach to completing the correct procedure to complete the task. But you don't want to give them too much, otherwise it can be overwhelming. Plans, sometimes referred to as programs, provide strategic and tactical instructions on how to execute an initiative or respond to a situation. Here, you're dealing with a certain time frame. It's usually defined in stages or designated resources. So, for example, if there is an incident, you have to activate the incident response plan. There's no debate, there's no discussion really. We have a plan, we have to execute it. Similarly, as we'll discuss later in the course, we'll develop business continuity plans. So in the event of a disaster, a natural disaster, or some other threat to the organization, we have to activate the plan. We need to know that it's in existence. Once we are in this mode of disaster recovery, let's say, you need to know where you are in your, which stage you are in the emergency. Plans are closely related to policy. So you can have an incident response policy, and that will include a requirement to publish, maintain, and test the plan. Right? The incident response plan gets its authority from the policy. Often the policy will be included in the plan document, right? So these are interrelated items, you can say. So you can have a policy, you can have a group that involves with vetting the policy, training people, that's part of the policy. The plan itself is the specific primarily procedures that will be in place, deployed once an emergency or an incident has been declared. So one thing you'll need to think about is how do standards, guidelines, and procedures support the policy document. So the standard dictates what is expected, the guideline helps you understand and suggests some ways to make it happen, and the procedure instructs you on how to do it. So a big part of this course is really writing policy. How the documents can be crafted makes a big difference on how it's going to be interpreted. Understand that your words in this regard have a lot of power. They can be subject to one or more interpretation. As lawyers, this is very intuitive, but as non-lawyers, you have to understand that sometimes people want to get out of performing their task, right? And so you've got to write it in such a way that there's no real room for either discretion or misinterpretation, right? So it's kind of an art more than a science in many respects. Over time and with experience, you'll develop a policy style and format. It's how the document flows and the words used to will make all the difference between how the policy is interpreted. So you've got to know your intended audience. I cannot stress this enough. It's a big deal. Really know who the policy is for. It's always a question that's relevant in this work. You've got to write your policy in an understandable and relevant manner, and you've got to consider writing a policy for employees of a multinational company. Maybe it's the case that English isn't the second language for the employees. You've got to use different words if you're writing for young employees, let's say. And so these are things you need to really keep in mind, the educational background, the level of experience of the employee when you are writing policy. So have good answers in your mind. You don't have to write this in the policy. You will have to write this in the policy, actually. There's usually a policy element on the audience. But understand in your mind who the policy is intended for. Some policies are intended for particular groups or people with a particular job function. And sometimes the policy is to report to the board of directors. So if there is that reporting requirement, we need to know who has to do the reporting. Otherwise, things will fall through the cracks. When you're writing a policy, you need to think carefully about its organization. How many sections and subsections are needed? There are two main schools of thought in this regard. The singular policy, which is what we will be doing for our final projects, is writing a policy which as a discrete document. There's one technology, and you are writing the policy, and you're building a policy library based on this one item. Consolidated policies, by contrast, group similar policies together and organize them by section and subsection. So, for example, you may have a policy that deals with, let's say, privacy and spam, for example. Those are somehow related. Your cookie policy and privacy policy and access to information policy could be grouped together in a consolidated format. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. You need to decide based on your company's requirements and your particular interest. Is writing singular or consolidated policies. For your group projects, you're writing singular policies. Now, the advantage of a singular policy is that it can be clear and concise. Each policy is targeted to an intended audience. The downside is that you need to manage multiple policy documents. There's going to be a loss of consistency. And that's more likely because you have to refer to multiple documents. You don't read the whole thing, right? But it's usually going to be shorter. Consolidated policies have the advantage of putting everything in one place. And so when anybody needs to look for the policy that's in one document, they need to be able to search that document, right? Downside is that there is, it's going to be a really large document in some cases. And oftentimes it's difficult to navigate because you've got to read the entire document, and most of it or much of it may not be relevant. So singular policies used to be recommended, but the current trend is toward consolidation. And so, it really depends on I've seen both types in the working environment. It depends on the person you're working with. You've got to be able to do both. Policy components depend on whether or not the format is going to be singular or consolidated. But some of the policy components are listed here. We need to understand how they're defined. You have version control, which deals with tracking changes. There are going to be many changes over time, many iterations of your policy document. You need to have an introduction to frame the document. You need to put policy headings there, identifying the topic, your goals and objectives, statements of policy, any exceptions, an enforcement clause, which will tell you what happens if you violate or fail to comply with the policy. Administrative notations are where you'd find additional information, and then the definitions are usually the glossary of terms. In an outline of a set of singular policy documents, you wanted it to look like this. You'll have an introduction, a list of headings, and your policy statements. Definitions would be kept in the policy itself, and sometimes they're in a separate document, which are related, so as to avoid redundancy. In a consolidated policy document, you're going to have an introduction, identifying the audience, have the objectives, and then the policy enforcement. You would have any exceptions, your version controls next, and then section 1 with the title of that particular policy with an overview, and then each of the policy components listed before going on to the next policy document. Version control is what helps you keep track of the policy and determine whether or not it's up for review. A version control document should include the version number, any change dates, name of the person making the change, a synopsis of the change, the effective date of the change. Those are the things that you need to have so you can quickly look at the document to know which version you are working with. Oftentimes you want to roll back the version to a previous version, or you need to know that you're dealing with the latest version. That's why that's important. In singular policies, the version control component will be split between the policy heading and administrative notation section. In a consolidated document, the version control is either at the beginning of the document or at the beginning of a section. The introduction of a policy will provide the policy with its context and meaning. It'll convey importance of understanding and adhering to a policy, and it will acquaint the reader with the document and its contents. It explains the exemption process as well as the consequences of non-compliance. And normally it's going to thank the reader for and reinforcing the authority of the policy. The introduction will have some sub-elements, you can say. It'll have an explanation of the objective and audience, the installation of the compliance is mandatory, it will describe the policy, it'll have the exemption process, it will thank the employee typically for complying, and have a signature of the person who was able to enforce that policy. In a singular policy document, it's usually a separate document. In consolidated policy documents, it's a preface followed by the version control table. Policy exceptions are where specific special situations where the policy does not apply. So, if you have a statement like no cameras allowed in the building, you may have an exception that mobile phones are okay, even though they do have cameras on them. But you want to keep the number of specific exceptions quite small because it will negate the imperative nature of the policy statement. You want to typically recommend a process by which exceptions are going to be granted. So the criteria for the exceptions should not be listed because it will constrain the discretion of the decision maker in this regard. And whether or not the exception is granted or rejected, the person requesting should have a written report with clear reasoning as to why the exception was granted or not. Just to reiterate, you need to keep the exceptions minimal. Too many exceptions to a rule will mean you have to rethink that rule. It can lead to employees thinking that the rule is unimportant, or it may result in a perception of favoritism extended to some employees but not others. And it's also very difficult to keep track of. If you say no cameras, then that's quite straightforward. If you allow it for certain things and not others, then it becomes more complicated. So an exceptions waiver, here's an example that you might include. Where compliance is not technically feasible or as justified by business needs, an exemption may be granted. Exemption requests must be submitted in writing to the COO, including justification and the benefits attributed to the exemption. Unless otherwise stated, the CAO and president have the authority to grant waivers. Any specific exemptions should be included in the policy statement section. A policy enforcement clause will assert the seriousness of the policy. So it's the consequences of violation, or sometimes referred to as a disciplinary action clause. You want to make sure it's proportionate to the rule being broken, and it usually is going to belong in the introduction. You don't want to list every possible punishment, but you may want to indicate the most severe punishment, such as dismissal. Here's an example of a policy enforcement clause. A violation of this policy may result in disciplinary action, which may include termination for employees and temporaries, a termination of employment relations in the case of contractors or consultants, and dismissal for interns and volunteers. Additionally, individuals are subject to civil and criminal prosecution. In the policy heading, you will identify the policy by name. You have the format and contents depends on the policy format, whether you're using singular or consolidated. Singular policies have to be able to stand on their own. They're self-contained documents. So you have to make sure that you know what the security domain is, the name of the organization, its version number, the authority, the effective date of the policy, any cross-references to standards, and supporting documentation. In consolidated policies, the heading serves as a section introduction and includes an overview. You're going to have cross-references, a lead author, and the administrative notation section. So what about policy goals and objectives? You've got to be able to answer the question, what is the goal of this policy? It should convey the intent of the policy, and there are often multiple objectives. Singular policies can be listed in the policy heading or in the body of the document. Consolidated policy documents, the objectives are grouped and will follow the policy heading. Here's an example of a singular policy on confidentiality agreement. Objectives. Confidentiality of organizational data is a key tenet of our information security program. In support of this goal, the company will require signed confidentiality agreements of all authorized users of information systems. This agreement shall conform to all federal, state, and regulatory union requirements. What's a policy statement? Well, the policy statement focuses on specifics of how the policy will be implemented. This is a high-level directive or the meat of the policy. It's going to list rules and actions that need to be followed. And in some cases, it references the standards or corresponding plans, such as the incident response plan, to implement that policy. So here's an example of singular policy on confidentiality agreements. This policy requires that staff sign a confidentiality policy agreement prior to being granted access to any sensitive information or systems. Agreements will be reviewed with the staff member when there is any change to the employment or contract or prior to leaving the organization. The agreements will be provided to the employees by the Human Resources Department. Administrative notations refer the reader to additional information and provide a reference to an internal resource. So they're cross-references. There may be corresponding standards that are incorporated, any supporting documents such as annual reports or job descriptions, and the policy author's name and contact information. Where you'll find administrative notations, you can either incorporate them at the heading or at the end of the document. It can be sometimes split between the two locations. In a consolidated policy document, it's typically located at the end of each section. Policy definitions can be seen as a glossary that's part of the policy, and it can include detailed technical information. You want to make sure that in your glossary or your policy definitions, there's something that's a particular term of art or is not standard language or maybe ambiguous. You want to include them in your policy definitions. You've got to make sure that it depends on the audience. They want to know what you mean by a certain term, and that those definitions are legally important. So lawyers will understand this very well, but you've got to make sure that you understand what is meant there and communicate that to the employee. So some summary questions you need to think about in this section is, why is it important that we know our audience when writing a policy? And then what are the important items, such as sections, subsections, or clauses, that must exist in a policy? Here are the rules. You've got to make sure that you are writing for your audience. You have to write in short sentences. Limit a paragraph to one subject. Be concise. Don't use jargon. If you don't have to, use an active voice. When you're referring to imperatives, you have to use must and not shall. You have to be consistent. You've got to omit redundant modifiers. So you would say, for example, instead of saying the end result was the honest truth, you would say something like the result was the truth. And so understand the language that you use in a policy document is super important. And you want to avoid double negatives. So think very, very carefully about the language that you're using when you're writing policy. So our next section, after looking at the components of a policy, is understanding the broader information security framework. Now, you need a framework because it will tell you what's going to be required. It can tell you what you can do or what you should do if it's necessary for certain certification in some cases, or give assurances for other companies or regulators. So it helps you plan out your security program. It also helps you keep organized. You have to think about building a house. You have certain rooms, you have a certain walkway, you've got a kitchen, you've got a bathroom, you've got a bedroom. You don't put those things on top of each other. You want to make sure that there is an architecture, you can say, of your document. And that's what a framework is. So there are, an information security program will classify needs into logical and manageable, what we refer to as domains. So there's a domain for access control or a domain for physical and environmental security, for example. The security framework that we're using here is going to be from ISO 27002. And it began as a British standard, and then it's been adopted by the ISO. And it's the current version is 2022. It's regarded as a technology neutral framework, and it provides a comprehensive set of information security recommendations comprising best practices in information security. Understanding that it's not perfect, it provides best practice. It helps you help an organization by adapting the framework and understanding where the policy gaps or the security gaps exist. So the organization could be commercial or not-for-profit organization, or it could be the public sector, in fact. So it's a very, very useful document for you to go and solve many problems within an organization. So the framework can be used for developing procedures and policies. It organizes the approach into developing policies, and it provides a method for grouping similar policies. These are organized into 14 domains or categories. So you need to, in order to use the framework, you've got to understand what the goals of each of the domains are. And that's what essentially this course is about. So information security policies focuses on the information security policy requirements that need to align a policy with the organization's objectives. So the organization has objectives. There is a framework when you're dealing with security or information security. What is super important before you embark on this exercise is to have management participation and support. If you don't have that, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to implement a policy like this. So we need to focus on establishing and supporting a management structure to implement and manage the information security within and across and outside the organization. In fact, it's a very broad remit. So the information security domain of will concentrate on employees, so it has an inward direction, but it also has an outward orientation also of third-party access to vendors and trading partners and the like, other service providers. So whether you're a company that is taking the service of third parties, or you're a third-party provider and you're seeking to gain access to larger companies, typically, you need to be able to have your documented information security program to be able to communicate that to another entity. Human resources security relates to the fact that relates to employees typically. It deals with a life cycle of employment, that is from recruitment to onboarding, on the job, and ultimately termination of all levels of employees. This is an area that is fraught with conflict because you may have to make sure that you terminate appropriately, complying with the employment standards legislation also, which is a very tricky fine line to balance that, in fact. Now we'll spend some time a lecture on this topic entirely. Asset management deals with the information security assets, from raw data to process data, intellectual property, software, physical devices, anything you need to track in terms of assets of the company. The domain is going to be focused on classification, assigning different classification levels, and maintaining an accurate inventory. You can't manage what you don't document in policy, so you need to have an asset tag associated with particular classes of information. The domain of access control focuses on authorization of access and preventing unauthorized use. So this can be complicated by remote locations. People are increasingly working from home. They have mobile access. All of these introduce new security challenges, which we have to account for. Cryptography is another security domain, and here you've got to figure out what is the appropriate and effective use of cryptography in order to protect the confidentiality, authenticity, and integrity of the information. Here, the primary focus is going to be on key management. The physical and environmental security domain focuses on the design maintenance of a secure physical environment to prevent unauthorized access, damage, and interference. Things here you're going to be focused on are the physical perimeter security, securing offices, protection of power supplies, data cables. Those are all physical and environmental security aspects. Operations security deals with what are the requirements to secure the operation of information processing facilities. So typically those are going to be data centers. You have to think about vulnerability management, protection of data loss, and evidence-based logging. So you're able to track the use, access, and provide an audit trail. Communication security deals with information in transit. Here you're going to have a number of network controls in place, such as antivirus software, spy software, intrusion prevention or detection, and encryption in place. Those are all part of your communications domain. Systems acquisition, development, and maintenance. The focus here is going to be on the security requirements for information systems, from code, from conception to destruction, so the systems development lifecycle. Here you're going to be interested in ensuring that you have controls in the development, maintenance of your software code, and what are the change control procedures, making sure that there are no vulnerabilities that are introduced to the system. Supplier relationships deal with the service delivery, third-party requirements, contractual obligations, and oversight. It's an important domain. Information security incident management. Here the focus is going to be on a consistent and effective approach to the management of information security incidents, including the communications of security events and weaknesses, such as data breach notification. In some cases, some sectors, such as the financial sector and the healthcare sector, breach notification is going to be mandatory. So you've got to make sure that there's within this domain, you're going to be caring about detection, reporting, response, escalation, and forensic practices to ensure you are able to determine what happened and how to review and update your policy. Business continuity management deals with protecting critical business processes from major failures. So many companies don't have a business continuity plan. They need one because it demonstrates that they have an ability to respond, or they've thought through different scenarios that may cause disruption to the organization, that they are able to continue with their business. Many companies did not have a continuity management plan in place for the pandemic, for example, and the ones that did were able to survive and thrive because they were able to switch from an in-person mode to a remote mode very quickly, and that was really necessary during that time. Compliance management is having a goal of ensuring the organization information systems conform to the internal policy, any local or national international laws, any regulatory or contractual obligations. Sometimes they are imposed upon you by other companies, whether or not you're dealing with if you have intellectual property rights, how they are respected, and copyright. Those are all things you want to be caring about in order to ensure that you are in compliance. Now, it is possible, given the complexity of what we've described, to have too many policies. If you have too many policies, you've got the risk of overwhelming the intended audience. You'll be really careful around this. So you've got to be effective and figure out, what is meaningful and relevant, and who are you sharing that information to. You want your policies to support and not hinder the organization's mission and goals. And not all organizations need all the policies that we've referenced in this standard. Some need to have a greater emphasis on certain domains and others not so much. So this is kind of a matter of judgment. So as a summary question and by way of conclusion, what you need to think about after listening to this and coming to the lecture is, when creating an information security policy, how would you use the ISO security domains that we've discussed? You need to think about that and be able to articulate why the ISO framework is important and how you're going to use it, adapt it, and apply it, implement it in an organization. That's it for this class, and I'll see you in the next session.